All right, we're live. So here's what we're gonna do. We'll go ahead and get started. First off, I wanted to say, I'm not sure if Tracy's in, but regardless, I wanted to say thank you to your Executive Director, Tracy Fitzsimmons, for the opportunity to provide this brief training for you all today. I also wanted to say thank you to Rocio for the opportunity, reaching out and connecting for this opportunity. That really means a lot, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. And to all of you, I want to say a big thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. I know that there is a lot going on. You have notes and meetings with families. I heard a rumor there's 25 RAP teams, and then now there's a residential treatment center up north, and I mean all kinds of beautiful additions to your region. And so I want to say thank you all for being here. Thank you. I truly appreciate that. Well, here's what we'll do for our workshop today. I'm going to continue to admit folks as they come in, but we'll get started with the content, all right? Here's my promise to you. I'm looking for about an hour delivery of the content with about half an hour for questions, thoughts, if you have any of those. And I'll be happy to provide as many answers as I can for y'all, all right? So let's go ahead and get rolling without further ado, right? So my name is Antonio Mexico. And for those of you who I've worked with before over at Olive Crest, hello again. It's a pleasure to be with you all. The focus for this workshop for this morning is serving LGBTQ plus people. And what we're going to be doing is examining social determinants for health and well-being while utilizing a culturally humble practice. That's the goal. That's what we're going to be doing. All right. So I'll go into a little bit about me first, just so you have some background. Those of you who are familiar with me, you may already know this information, but those of you that are new, all right, here's just a little bit about who's doing the training for you today, right? So for the past 17 years, I've been serving in the fields of child welfare, juvenile justice, education, and the mental health systems. 10 of those years were with Olive Crest. So I came over early, I think it was in about 2008 as a wraparound supervisor. Rocio was the original of that team one, and there was maybe 30 families enrolled in the program. And if that gives you any history of how far you all have come today, there's a little bit of an amazing story behind that, right? But 10 of those years I had spent with Olive Crest, and they were some of the most impactful and wonderful years of my career, to be honest. My degrees are from the University of Redlands. So my bachelor's is in sociology. I have a master's in education counseling with a PPSC credential. My doctorate work is in education. I'm a doctor of education with an emphasis in social justice. So that's just a little bit about the educational background that I'll be bringing to the training today. My experience is primarily serving at-risk youth and their families, mostly those who have experienced trauma, abuse, and neglect, the very kiddos that you spend your days and families working in and out relentlessly to shift, right, the pattern, to break the cycle of child abuse. Those were the families that I also worked with as well. I started in residential care back in the day when we had group homes and an RCL level 14 group home out in Orange County. So I've had the full gamut of some of the experiences you all have had if you've worked your group home, furniture thrown at me, every word that you could be called. I learned a lot of new curse words working residential. You know, I came back home and I would tell my fiance at the time, do you know what this means? The kid called me that. And we had to process that together, but it was all good, right? Later on, I moved into wraparound, and when I was a school counselor, I ran substance dependency groups, conflict resolution groups, and most of my work has been in Orange, San Bernardino, and Riverside counties. Nowadays, I serve as an assistant professor over at Cal Baptist University. I teach in our social work department. I see a few of my students here, and so welcome back. It's good to see you all as well. In July, I'll be stepping into a new role as our Associate Dean for Academic Services within our College of Behavioral Social Sciences. So I'll be starting that role in a month. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. And I also serve as our director for the Center for Community Engagement and Social Innovation. The idea behind that is what I want, my deepest goal is whatever we learn in school, I don't want it to be something that we just kind of toss away and put on a bookshelf later. It has to equate to real life change, right? And so that's why I enjoy doing these workshops. What we learn can impact lives. So that's the goal, all right, for today. What I'm going to be doing is I wanted to say first off, you know, after I scheduled the presentation with Rocio, we were looking at dates that worked. We locked in June 1st, and it couldn't have been more beautiful timing. June 1st, as many of you know, marks the beginning of Pride Month in the United States. And that's really a milestone in 1969, representing the Stonewall Uprising in Manhattan, which really gave way to ongoing pursuit of health equity for LGBTQ plus individuals. It just so happened that our training starts on June 1. And so it's a nice way to begin the month, I think. And so hopefully you'll find the information helpful. What I'm really going to be doing today is we're going to focus on, let's go back one slide. We're going to focus on really 4 topics. That's all I want to bring you today for the hour that we're together. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you some theoretical frameworks on working with LGBTQ plus individuals. There's 2 that I would really like to serve as the foundation for our conversation today. We're going to examine all the content I deliver to you through 2 frameworks, and I'm going to share those with you. They're not too lofty or difficult, like they're really easy to follow and to break down. The second thing we're going to do is examine terminology associated with the LGBTQ plus community. This is important because oftentimes I know that as a case manager, as staff working in the homes, whatever the case is, sometimes you may be nervous to engage in conversations around matters associated with LGBTQ plus individuals because you're wondering, what if I say the wrong thing or whatever the case is? So I'm going to help by providing some current terminology related to the community. I'm going to talk a little bit about health disparities and barriers that are impacting LGBTQ plus individuals. And then what I'm going to do is give you some concrete strategies that you can implement today with children and families that you're working with, all right, on your caseloads, in your homes, right, in foster placement, whatever the case is. All right, that's our goal. The first theoretical orientation I was hoping that we can adopt when we look at the material today is a cultural humble approach. And it's my understanding that this notion of cultural humility isn't foreign to you. Some of you may remember I did a presentation where we discussed this on implicit bias, right? And it's my understanding you may have even future training opportunities working with tribal families and individuals to discuss cultural humility. Well, the same thing will apply here in our work with LGBTQ plus individuals. What I'm going to ask us to do is look through the lens of the content today, not necessarily from our own personal thoughts, opinions, upbringing around this topic, but from a culturally humble approach. And there's a specific way that we can do that. So many of you know, like back in the day, if you've been doing this for a while, we used to have trainings on cultural competency. You heard that word competency all the time, right? We started to move away from that a little bit. Competency was really kind of suggesting that if you attend a workshop like this today, the danger of that is that some individuals may say, well, I attended a training on LGBTQ plus individuals, so therefore I know everything there is to know about serving those individuals. And I really want us to be careful about that, right? I don't want us to assume that just because we've gone to one training, we know it all. That's adopting a culturally humble approach. So for many of us, what we know is cultural humility then is not really a destination, it's a process. It's a process of growing and understanding. And we're just taking a step in that process today. So cultural humility isn't really a list of do's and don'ts. If you notice today, I'm going to offer you recommendations that are founded in evidence-informed practices on how to work with children and families who identify in the community. But this isn't a hard and fast rule. In fact, many of you, as you work with children and families, you'll start to discover there are nuances, right? And different ways of individuals identifying with their gender or sexuality. So one rule doesn't necessarily fit all. So cultural humility is about gaining knowledge and assessing our ongoing attitudes of individuals we serve. This is going to be important, right? So I don't want you all to feel conflicted. As you're going through the content, if you're thinking to yourself, this is different, or I haven't heard that term before, I'm unfamiliar with that term, you don't necessarily need to think of it as immediately black and white, right or wrong. Consider this as different and consider that the topics that we're bringing to you are the way that individuals live their lives, navigate the world around them every day. Right? That's all I'm asking us to do. So for us to be culturally humble practitioners, social workers, parent partners, line staff in residential care, foster parents, case managers, whatever the case is, what we're really doing is committing to being engaged in a lifelong self-process of examination. So don't get on yourself and say, I'm having a hard time with this. I think I am wrong. Think about this in the context of, what are these feelings emerging for me, and how can I continue to learn and develop to be better for the client in front of me this week, next month, if that makes any sense, okay? And then finally, what we're going to do is you want to develop partnerships, right? This is what you all do so well. You understand that it takes a village. It takes a village, right? And so all of us, what we're doing is we're building a village, a network of support for our children, for our families, and for ourselves as practitioners. So that's the first rule. Let's try to adopt a culturally humble approach today. The second one I'm going to ask you to do is we're going to put on our thinking caps for today. I'm going to throw a fancy term out your way, $5 term to use at cocktail parties to impress people, but don't worry, it's not that big of a deal. And it's called the sociological imagination. I'm going to ask us to adopt a culturally humble approach today and to use our sociological imaginations. There was this old guy way back in the day who passed away in the 60s. He was a sociologist named C. Wright Mills. And basically what he said was, in a nutshell, is that every day, social life, the life that we're all living, when we go about working, worshiping, spending time with our families and our kiddos and our caseload, it's a product of a complex interplay between societal forces and personal characteristics. What did C. Wright Mills mean by that? Well, we know as practitioners, sometimes our passion is working with individuals, right? We want to work with one person, but we have to understand that individuals are both shaped by and are shaping their environment, okay? The two exist synonymously. They don't exist apart from one another, all right? And so we have to understand that as we go about doing our work and living our lives every day, C. Wright Mills asked us to appreciate the fact that we are influenced by society, and at the same time, we are influencing society, others around us. Think about that in your work with children and families, right? There's been times where you've left your job and driven home and you have a giant smile on your face. And that smile is because you shared in a joyful moment with a child or family and it felt good. You saw a child or a family break a milestone, a barrier for themselves, and you knew you were a part of that process. What happened? You were transformed by the environment of that family, but guess what? You transformed a child or a family's life, right? That's what C. Wright Mills is talking about. There's a beautiful quote. I know some of you are Brené Brown fans, right? Some of you may be familiar with her work. And Dr. Brené Brown had said, and I think this speaks well to the sociological imagination, I'm a map maker and a traveler, right? This is the notion of as I go through life, I am paving the way for others in the work that I do, but I also am traveling upon a course that has been laid out for me from what others have set before me, right? We're all map makers, we're all travelers. My goal for you today, the content that I bring you will empower you, right, to become a map maker with children and families who are members of the LGBTQ plus community as you travel along with them in their journeys, right? That's the goal for today. All right, so let's move into our content. Terminology. So oftentimes in society, we are hearing the term sex and gender, and the two oftentimes get blurred together when we're discussing matters related to gender identity, sexual orientation, or the LGBTQ plus community. For the sake of the training today, I want to clarify the two terms very briefly. We are going to lean more into our conversation on gender, Briefly, sex is a term that's biologically associated. It's based off our physiology, things like chromosomes, our reproductive organs, our hormones. Those are what nature gives us, right? Nature, when we're born, has a predetermined what our chromosomes and hormones will be based on our genetic makeup. That's sex. For the process of our training today, we're going to focus on gender, okay? Now, gender is different. Gender is culturally defined. In sociology, we refer to gender as a social construct, Some of you may know that if you've taken classes with me, that it's early in our lifespan when we start to understand and define gender for ourselves. Society plays a big role in that. And our definition of gender and the privileges that come with that vary from one country or society or culture to the next. So what we assign as masculine or feminine in our country, in the United States, may look different from attributes that are considered to be masculine or feminine in Japan, in Africa, in India, in Mexico, right? So gender is a social construct. It's about when we're 3 to 5 years old, that as a child, we start to examine what gender roles mean. What does it mean to be a boy from the biological sex-oriented component? But then we're starting to unpack, what do boys wear? How do boys dress? What do boys play with? And our environment heavily impacts that. For the sake of our training today, we'll be discussing primarily notions of gender and gender identity, okay, for our training. All right. So let's move into some terms, if you don't mind, and this will be helpful just to start our conversation. In the 1960s and 70s, psychology really focused on what we refer to as a binary definition of gender as well as human sexuality. Let me differentiate those two really quick. We discussed gender, right, as a social construct. Sexuality is something different, but they also sometimes get merged or muddled between the two, but they're actually two different things. Gender is the identity based on our social makeup, if we identify as masculine, feminine, or something different from that. Sexuality is who we choose to pursue a romantic relationship with, who we choose to fall in love with, okay, and what that looks like for us in our relationships. And in the 1960s and 70s, we really had a binary approach, bi meaning two, right? What research taught us back then was there was boy, girl, straight, or gay. That was really the spectrum, the limitations of our understanding of gender and sexual orientation in the 1960s and 70s. As research, therapy, education began to expand, and we began to work with multiple populations throughout our country, we began to understand that this binary approach didn't really fit other individuals' understandings or identities around gender and sexual orientation. And so we started to develop what we call an expansive terminology rather than binary. Expansive meaning it goes beyond two, beyond male and female, beyond straight or gay, okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to present to you a few terms in the expansive realm of the LGBTQ plus community, understanding that not everyone in society that we meet is going to prescribe or identify with simply male or female, straight or gay, all right? It expands beyond that. So I want to give you some current terminology. Now, quick disclaimer, remember taking a culturally humble approach to this. The terms that I'm putting up here are the terms that are current as of, let's say what time it is, 10/21 on June 1st, right, 2022. I want to provide a disclaimer to that. As we know, terms in our social circles, they change, they adapt, they're fluid, right? So remember, we don't want to be culturally competent. We have to understand that our lexicon, our vocabulary for serving LGBTQ plus individuals or families, it's not going to stay fixed 5 years from now. Some of these terms may change, which is why we want to commit to a lifelong process of learning. So even when I do trainings like this, before I update my material, I've got to go back and do the research to make sure that the terminology we're using is still relevant and it's applicable to everyday life. And that's even outside of gender and sexuality. That's in regards to race, class, socioeconomic status, all of those terms, okay? So let's just start with a couple. Now, I'm not going to read all of these to you. That's why I'm providing with the PowerPoint, but there's some that you may encounter more so in your work with children and families than others. Those are the ones I've chose to highlight for today, all right? Let's talk about this term androgynous. We sometimes hear this in the news, and androgynous is really an individual who is identifying and or presenting as neither distinguishably male or female, masculine or feminine. Let's put this in a really basic term. My mom used to say that when I was a baby, when I was a newborn, it was really difficult for folks to know if I was a little boy or a little girl is what they thought, right? And so some of you may know that I'm a blend of Mexican and Filipino and Creole. So when I was born, my family as a gift, they gave me this little onesie and it was yellow, all right? And it said Mexipino, all right, right here on the chest, all right? But it was yellow. And we know that in the context of the United States, yellow is more considered a gender neutral color. It does not really lean towards masculine or feminine, right? And so she would take me out to the market and people would be in line and they would say, oh my goodness, you know, they would see that little newborn and they would say, you have such a cute little, and they would kind of pause for a second, right? Like, I don't know what to call this little kiddo because I'm not sure it's a boy or a girl and I don't want to insult the mom, right? And so she would say, oh, it's a cute little boy. This is my son. And it would move on. But that's the notion of being androgynous, is that when we when we see an individual may not have distinguishing features of necessarily male or female, or they may choose to blend their gender expression through their clothing and other things like, like in our country, a beard is considered more masculine in that sense. They may blend their look, their appearance in order to present as androgynous, okay? There's a term that many younger individuals in our society are actually identifying as, and this goes with millennials and a little bit younger, is saying that they're in a relationship, but they consider themselves identifying as asexual. Now, asexual just means that there's a lack of sexual attraction or desire to other people. That doesn't mean that that individual is not in a deeply intimate relationship with someone else. Someone who identifies as asexual may say that I have a partner and I love that partner deeply, but I don't choose to express my feelings for that partner in a sexual way. The sexual relationship is separate and sometimes non-existent in our relationship. I love that person for who they are, but I don't choose to express it in that physical way. That would be asexual. A term that's really prominent in the media today is the term cisgender, right? And cisgender, really the term cis comes from the Latin word, which literally means same side, same side. So this term cisgender. And that's really just used to describe a person whose gender identity aligns with those typically associated with what they've been assigned at birth. So let me give you an example of that, okay? So I identify as a male, cisgender, heterosexual, okay? So what that means is I was assigned male at birth. My gender is associated and aligns with that. So I identify as male, and I'm heterosexual, meaning I'm attracted to female, okay? And so that's my identity. Now I have to let you know, remember we talked about a culturally humble approach. There are blind spots to what I do, right? So in this society, in the context of the United States, then a male, heterosexual, cisgender is going to be privy to certain privileges, and I will not face some similar discrimination than individuals who identify outside of my identity, right? And so there's blind spots to that. So I just have to understand that in my work with others. A clinical term that we use is gender dysphoria, and this is really the significant distress that's caused when a person's assigned birth is not the same as with which they identify, all right? So sometimes kiddos that we work with that are young and early in their lifespan, they're still understanding the social construct of what it means to be masculine, feminine, or not in the context of our culture. And when they start to look around them at the world, and they start to say, okay, the world is telling me, like I go to the supermarket and believe it, have you ever gone to like the gift card aisle in a supermarket? There's literally a section now like gendered gift cards. You can get gift cards that say for him, and it's like, Outback Steakhouse and some brewery or something like that. And then it says for her, and it's got like spa treatments and all these other things, right? And so a kiddo is looking at this and saying, so what I'm learning in my interaction out in my environment, using our sociological imagination, is that if I identify as a boy, boys do these things, they go to these places, girls do something different, right? And so what happens is if that's not aligned, if they feel that their gender might be different from what society is prescribing as mainstream, there's a dysphoria, a distress that occurs within them emotionally. And the term that we use for that is gender dysphoria. I ask folks to consider this because sometimes the weight of that dysphoria is very heavy for the children that we're working with. They're maybe even scared to share that they have these feelings of dysphoria out of fear of humiliation, shame, or isolation from the people that they love the most, right? And so we want to be sensitive to that, culturally humble to that, to understand that even when a child starts to share feelings of dysphoria with us, they trust us, or they must be willing to trust us in that moment. And we want to be attuned to that trust, okay? Let's move through a couple of other terms here. There's a term gender fluid that I know sometimes is something that you may encounter in the field. I certainly did. Gender fluid really is a person who doesn't identify with a single fixed gender, okay? So at times in my early days in case management, I was working with an individual of the LGBTQ+ community. They were exploring and attempting to understand where their gender identity was for them at that period in their life. So I would show up to this client's home and they would say that week that I was meeting with them, can you please use a male pronoun when you're addressing me, or a male name? And they would give me the male name. No problem. We use that pronoun, we use that name in the context of the meeting. A couple weeks later, I would go to the home, I would have our case plan, we're meeting with the family, and the individual would say, they would say to me, you know what, can you please refer to me as a female pronoun and use this female name this week? That individual was going through a process of understanding what gender identity meant to them. And in the process of doing that, their gender was not fixed from week to week or month to month, that it could change, it could shift, all right? And so I'm gonna have strategies that you can use in these situations towards the end of the training here, but I wanted to explain a little bit about the terminology so that if you encounter that in the field, you might be able to give some word or understanding to that, some clarity by saying, so this is an individual that may identify as gender fluid, okay? Couple more terms to give you here. Pansexual. So there's a term pansexual, and what it describes is a person who has the potential for emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to people of any gender, not necessarily simultaneously or in the same way. So an individual who identifies as pansexual may say, you know what, I am really romantically gravitate towards individuals who I feel a strong romantic connection with. And that's not necessarily bound by gender. So the difference for me identifying as a cisgender heterosexual male is that what I'm looking for in my physical attraction is from female. And also what that lends to is I also want to have a deep, intimate relationship with that person, right? I want to be compatible with that person. Someone who identifies as pansexual may say the compatibility comes first. Gender is not necessarily prescribed for me. It can be of any gender, okay? So there's a difference there. Finally, the last term that I want to give you before I go into a specific bit of terminology around transgender, transsexual is the term queer. Now, I want to be careful with how we use this term, okay? Because it has a different connotation to different folks. Remember when I said I have blinders because of how I identify and that grants me privilege in our society? I want to be sensitive to that. So there's some members of the LGBTQ plus community who may say they do not have a problem with the term of identifying or being referred to as queer, okay? That just means having an expression of fluid identities or orientations. However, and I'd like to caution us with this as we do our work, in the past, especially in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, queer was also used as a derogatory term to belittle, subjugate, or discriminate against members of the LGBTQ plus community. It had been used to harm and to label and to other, okay? So for that reason, and this is just personally me, you may take a different approach to this, I choose not to use the word queer as a descriptor for individuals of the LGBTQ plus community. Why is that? Because I don't identify as a member of the community, and I would never want my terminology that leaves my mouth to be perceived as oppressive to another group, okay? That's me. Now, at times though, I've had the honor of working with LGBTQ plus people who have said, it's okay. Like, I'm proud of this term queer, and I know that you're not using it in a belittling way. I'm comfortable if you want to refer to me as such. And in those cases, I let them know that I actually really appreciate the trust and the knowledge that that's where my heart is, right? I don't want to come at it from othering someone, but I let them know that out of respect to them and to the community, I don't want to take a word that was used to do harm and use that word when I'm not a member of the group themselves. So out of respect, I say, can I address you by your pronoun or by your name? Would that be okay? And more than 100% of the time, folks are saying, that's absolutely fine. I can respect that, okay? All right. Now, if you've got questions, I know some of you may have questions about some of the terminology or some of the concepts I'm reviewing. I'm going to give you time at the end and we can move through questions, okay? So I just want you to know there'll be an opportunity for that. Okay, perfect. So let's move along. Perhaps one of the most dominant terms that's being used in society today, the terminology that we're reading the most on, that's being discussed most across media and other platforms, has been the terms transgender or transsexual. And so I want to be very specific in the terminology that we're using. This is all evidence-based and coming from a lot of research. There's a brilliant book, absolutely amazing, by an author, Andrew Solomon, and he wrote this book, Far from the Tree, as long as a few others. If you want to dive into that book, there's a specific section on transgender and transsexuality that's rooted in his research with interviewing hundreds of individuals that identify within this group. And so he provides some clarity to these terminology here. Transgender and transsexual, we want to think of those as two different things, okay? Transgender is an encompassing term, so it's inclusive of anyone whose behaviors depart significantly from the norms of gender suggested by his or her anatomy at birth, okay? So it's just, if we're seeing ourselves outside of that binary identity and we're moving into expansive, okay, there's that term. Now, transsexual is usually referring to someone who has had surgery or hormone therapy to align his or her body with the non-birth gender, all right? So that's where we start to move into some distinguishing factors when we're dealing with trans individuals, okay? So here's some terminology. When we use, so an individual says, I am a trans man, what they're saying is that they were born female and they became male, okay? Trans woman would be the opposite of that. Now, a lot of times people come to me and say, Antonio, I'm curious, right? And parents would come to me very worried at times. And they would say, my son, and I'll give you an example. I worked with a dad. The dad was really distressed, right? And this dad was military, law enforcement. You know, he had a big, brilliant beard like Anthony's. I'm envious of Anthony's beard. And, you know, he had muscles and he was very machismo. You know, he was like, this is what boys do in our world. And he came to me and he says, I'm really worried about my son because my son is choosing sometimes to wear his little sister's costumes and clothes and play with her toys. And he says, I think my son might be gay. This is what the dad said to me. I said, why would you think he's gay? And he says, well, because he's dressing in this way. And I said, your son's 6. He's never dated before, has he? And he says, no, I never really thought of it that way. And I said, well, we're discussing two different things. Gay is in reference to sexual orientation. I said, what you're discussing is gender. Okay, I said, those are two separate things. I said, so your son is exploring right now, what does it mean to identify as male or female based on the social context that he's been put in? So I gave him an example. I said, I have a godson. His name is Elijah, right? And Elijah, when he was 3, was 1 year younger than my daughter, okay? So they would come over and play. My daughter, and this is just how we raised our daughter, okay, was that if she liked the G.I. Joes, we bought her G.I. Joes. If she liked the tutu or wanted to dress up as Moana, she dressed up as Moana. If she liked a Nerf gun, she got a Nerf gun. If one day she wanted to dress in camo, she dressed in camo, or any combination of those things, right? So in our house, she's running around the house in a tutu with a camouflage jacket, and she's got G.I. Joe and a Barbie car, and she's just all over the place having a blast. That's her. That's what she was interested in, right? But my godson would come over and he thought it was great, right? He thought this tutu is bling, like this is amazing, right? And so what he would do is he would oftentimes start to dress in some of those costumes. He would play with the G.I. Joes, he would play with the Barbies. This was something that really got to his dad too and said, well, is he gay? I said, no, he's just playing with toys because he hasn't learned some of that socialization, that social construct of what gender means. I said, he's literally in the process of learning that now. I said that if he was in Japan and he was raised in Japan, his idea of how to dress as a masculine person in Japan would look different from the United States. Any of you ever gone to Ontario Mills? You give me an example of this. And we have a lot of folks from different cultures all over the world, right? Coming to Ontario Mills. It always kind of, I'll be honest, makes me feel a little sad because they're sitting there, they're just like forking out the cash, right? They're making it rain. They're walking out with like 12 Coach purses, and I've got one that I had to save up for, you know? And I'm like, wow, they know how to spend the money here. But if you notice, style of dress, style of what we refer to as masculine or feminine changes amongst cultures, right? It's not uncommon for individuals, males from Europe, or even from certain Asian countries to come and they're wearing a wallet like a satchel that's on the side, right? Here in the US, what do? We put our wallet in our pocket. It's a little bit different. Those understandings are contextual based on the environment in which we're raised. So I encourage folks that when we're working with families, sometimes your parents may not have that understanding, right? And they're worried that somehow wearing the tutu is going to equate to a sexual orientation later. Those are two different things. I let them know your child is still a child, right? They're too young to date. They're not interested romantically in anyone in school just yet. They're still learning who they are, right? We don't have to worry at this point. Inclusive language then around the transgender community can include things like being declared female. That means being born declared female or male at birth, okay? That's what was put on your birth certificate. And then later becoming affirmed male or female. When you come out and an individual says, no, I'm transgender, I was declared male at birth, but now I've been affirmed female, that's the terminology that we use. Therefore, then, when you're working with clients, some may ask you this specifically. They may say that I identify as transgender, I've been affirmed female, okay? They may say, can you please refer to me by my post-transition name of ... whatever that is, okay? That's the name, right, that they've identified with following that transition. The reason why this is important and respectful that we want to attempt to do is we want to honor the individual and their identity of who they are in front of us, not necessarily everything that came before that. And so it's helpful when we're working with children or families to use the post-transition name rather than the pre-transition name, okay? Can I throw one more thing out regarding that I've seen families also working with in this time? I was working with it was a mom, and I was a school counselor at the time. And the mom came to me and said, you know, my daughter, who was, you know, declared female at birth, has now transitioned and identifies as male, right? And this was very difficult for the mom. The mom she was a mom just like anyone else that was scared now for her son. She was worried, what would this mean for her son at school? Would he be bullied? Would he be isolated? Would he lose friends, right? And the mom was having a hard time really articulating, though, what she was so angry and scared of. Like, she couldn't really put a finger on it. And over the course of us talking together, you know, I said, based on, to me, what I'm hearing that you're going through is you're grieving. I said, what you're doing is you're scared and worried for your son, rightfully so. Any parent would be. They care about their child, right? But it sounds to me like you're also grieving the loss of your daughter, you know, because your son transitioned. Your son is no longer a girl in their eyes. And the mom just starts kind of just bawling, you know, she's just bawling at my desk, and I'm giving her tissues and like, oh my gosh, you know, what did I do? And she said, that's exactly it. She says, it's not that I don't agree or will support my son in their journey moving forward, but I miss having a daughter, right? I miss looking back at the pictures and the family events, and I miss my daughter. And I think that once we were able to name the grief around this topic, it was helpful for her to go back and have a conversation with her son about that she loves her son. She just misses her daughter from time to time, right? And that was a way to start the conversation in a way that was healthy and working towards this place of inclusion. So let's shift gears for a minute, right? And let's talk a little bit about mindset. So remember when I said we're both shaped by and we're shaping our environment, right? The sociological perspective. In the 80s, we usually heard this term, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, sexual preference, right? And then what we saw was like in the 90s and early 2000s, a term shifting over to sexual orientation. Some of you may be familiar, that's what we're using now, right? And there was a reason for that. It's kind of similar to why we shifted from cultural competency to cultural humility. Words really matter, right? So individuals would often say, so what is it? Is it sexual preference or is it sexual orientation? What's the terminology that we use? So I'd ask us to consider, and this is the thought process behind why we shifted our language, okay, over the years. For many of us, we don't remember a specific moment when we woke up and actively chose our race, do we? Like, I don't remember waking up as a 5-year-old, looking in the mirror while I was brushing my teeth and said, yeah, Antonio, guess what? You're going to be a blend of Latino and you're going to be Creole and you're Filipino today, right? Done. Landed on that. Check that box, right? Many of us don't wake up at a certain point in our life and say, you know what, today, Antonio, we're going male, right? You got a choice. I'm going male. I'm sticking with it. That's my answer, right? We don't do that. And many times for us, we also didn't choose our sexual identity. For some of us, maybe that was different. For many of us, we just found, right, that person. We saw that person the first time, maybe it was in 4th grade, right? Maybe it was Michelle Gonzalez sitting across the desk. And I just said, wow, she's really pretty, right? And so we suddenly discovered that there was something within us, a part of us, that led us to become romantically attracted to someone else. So we didn't wake up really choosing these things for ourselves. In the course of me working with LGBTQ plus individuals, I learned something that I'm still dedicated to getting right, right? Many times you'll also hear this term, and we want to be helpful. We'll say, you know, what's your preferred pronoun? To a member of the LGBTQ plus community, it's not about preferred, it's who they are, right? So that kiddo that the mom came into my office as a counselor that was bawling, right? He didn't say, he is my preferred pronoun. He says, I am he, right? Like that's who I am. In my mind, in my heart, in my feelings, this is who I am. So really we shifted to sexual orientation, not preference, because in our work with individuals, we start to understand that this is who an individual is. This is who they are. It's not who they prefer to be. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to be moving through some of the social determinants for health as well as barriers associated with the LGBTQ plus community. I ask folks to consider this when we use the term sexual preference, right? I'd say I don't know of one kiddo or family I've worked with who has chosen a life where there's increased rates of suicidality, increased rates of discrimination, hate speech, or a lack of legislative support that wanted that for themselves, right? I don't know one person that woke up and said, yep, you know what? I can't wait to be belittled for my sexual orientation today. I can't wait to be bullied or made fun of because of my race, right? Or because of my ability or my size. We are who we are. And so it's not a choice, it's who we are, okay? So I just wanted to propose that to you all. There's 2 theories associated with sexual orientation that really have sort of gone the way of the dodo that I want to kind of point out because we're moving in another direction. Remember, I said these conversations are fluid. As we explore these topics, they change. And so here's the shift that we're seeing. There's 2 theories in particular, essentialist theory. One is that sexual orientation is fixed and unitary, and it's inborn. We're born with it. There's another form, a theoretical orientation called constructionist theory. And this is really talking about sexual orientation being fluid and constructed by complex configurations of society, history, and interpersonal factors. Now, for those of you, let me take you back to Psychology 101. Remember that first class you sat in? This would be defined, essentialist theory, as what? Nature. Nature. Constructionist theory would be defined as nurture. Nurture, okay? What we're born with and what our environment, how our environment impacts us. Where theory is taking us now in the field of psychology as well as sociology is understanding that just like we've seen in other aspects of psychology, nature and nurture are integrated. They're intermingled with one another. They don't exist synonymously or independent of each other. And so what we're seeing with sexual orientation and identity is oftentimes individuals, there may be, what research is saying, some biological factors that may make us identify differently outside of that binary approach from birth. But there also may be other factors, social factors, that influence who we choose to love and seek a meaningful relationship with, okay? So just a couple of things to think about. In regards to identity, here's a big tip that I learned that I wanted to share with you all that might be helpful in working with individuals, right? So our focus today, and this is my hesitancy around providing workshops on specific topics, even things like race, socioeconomic status, we run the danger of really starting to see a person as only one aspect of their identity when there's really so much more to a person's identity than one attribute, right? So we would call this the identity wheel, the identity wheel. And if you look at this wheel, if you were to consider your identity, who you are as a person, you would say that probably who you are as a person is a blend of all of these things, right? The country that we're living or that we were born in, right? our socioeconomic status, our gender, our sex, our sexual orientation, of course. But our identity is also shaped by the first language that we learn to speak, right? Our emotional development, right? Our age, our religious affiliation, our race, all of these things make up who we are. The danger of a training like this is if we walk away and let's say we receive a client that we're working with next week, and that client on our referral form says they identify as LGBTQ plus, as a member of the community. If we go into that interaction with that child or that family with that at the forefront of our head, believing that's everything that defines that person's identity, then we're not honoring the entirety of that person, right? No one we know wants to see us only as our race. No one only wants to see us as the country we were born in or as the language that we speak. We are the sum of all of these attributes. And so what we want to be attuned to is the fact that even though a member may be, we may be working with a member of the LGBTQ plus community, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the identity that they think about most often. It might be a secondary or third identity that is a part of who they are, but they don't lead with that in all of their discussions, right? So this is something to consider. Now, there's another theory that's formed with that might help our understanding of it. So if we are an individual made of all of these things, we understand then that all of our experiences are different. Right? Picture what it's like if race was our primary identity.
Good stuff. Y'all want to listen?
Let me hold on. We got a guest speaker here. All right, I got it. All right. So think about if race is our primary identity, right? And we were both of the same race, but one grew up in California and one grew up in the Deep South. That experience would look very different based on the region that we grew up in, right? If I speak Spanish, right, and Spanish is my dominant language, right? And I go to live in Mexico, that's going to be very different than if I go to live in the United States, especially if I go to live in different parts of the United States, right? Our experiences are shaped by our identity, and there's multiple layers to that. When our identities come together and overlap to make us who we are as individuals, we refer to that as intersectional theory, right? I think I see Vanessa smiling because this should be a lesson that she took from one of our classes together. I won't call you out, Vanessa, it's all good. But this intersectionality and this intersectional theory was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. And what it really states is that we understand that individuals' identities, they overlap. They're a combination of beautifully diverse experiences that make our lives who they are, right? So think about this in the notion of an LGBTQ plus individual. They are also maybe African-American or Latino, right? Yeah, they may identify as maybe gay or straight or otherwise, but they also may be an American or from another country. They may also have a physiological need like diabetes to be cared for, right? They're the sum of all of these things. They're not one thing, right? So as someone coming in to work with a person, I want to understand how all of these make up their identity. I worked with an individual who identified as gay. He was male. He identified as male, cisgender male. And we were having a conversation about identity and just what this meant for him. And he shared something with me that really stuck with me. He said, you know, and this was a family that was out in the desert. He says, you know, a lot of people look at me first, and when they meet with me, they want to ask me right away about my gay identity, my sexual orientation. He said, I grew up in Palm Springs. He says, I have faced very little discrimination in my community, in my neighborhood, because of the nature of the culture in which I'm in. He says, now, if you ask me what it was like growing up in another state, you're going to get a different experience, a different response from someone else. He says, for me, the foundation of my identity has been male. And he says, and I'm American. I served in the military. I'm proud of who I am. He says, and so it's hurtful when someone goes straight to one attribute, whatever that is, and says, this is who you are. And so this is how I want to work with you moving forward. So a helpful consideration might be that when we're working with individuals, we're asking them, what does this part of the identity mean to you? How much of that is that first, second, or third in your identity, okay? And what does that look like for you? How does that manifest on a daily basis? There are some health disparities that impact LGBTQ plus individuals in particular, and I'll move through these quickly because I want to give us time to work with strategies, okay? How can we serve individuals, show up for them the best way possible, right? What research has shown us through healthcare systems as well as psychological and sociological research, LGBTQ youth are 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide and are more likely to be homeless. And it's estimated that about 20 to 40% of all homeless youth are members of the LGBTQ plus community. LGBTQ plus people are much more likely to smoke and use higher rates of alcohol, drugs, and they also battle depression and anxiety at disproportionate rates, disproportionate. Doesn't mean they're the only ones, right, that have depression or anxiety, but disproportionately, this impacts this group a little more. Elderly LGBTQ plus individuals also face additional barriers to their health because of isolation, diminished family supports, and reduced availability of social systems, okay? There's 3 really main barriers that the LGBTQ plus community faces when it comes to healthcare and access to resources. This is helpful for us to understand because when we first step into a home or a client comes into our care, our clinic, our residential treatment facility, that may be a member of the LGBTQ plus community, they're carrying all the experiences with them, right? So think about a time, let's just take it out of this context for a second. And for you therapists in the room, right? You step in and you want to do an intake with a kiddo. And this kiddo will not give you anything. They won't open up. They don't want to share anything about their experiences, their trauma. And when you ask them why, they say, because I have met with so many therapists in my life, and it's been negative that I'm tired of telling my story. Right? Like, why do I need to sit down in front of another stranger and open up in the deepest way possible, right? Just for you to be leaving a month later. And they don't want to go through it, right? Because their experiences with previous therapists has been negative in some cases. And so what does that do? It sets the tone for you, right? In the work that you're doing. Think about that in the context of LGBTQ plus people. What they're facing are primarily 3 social factors that weigh heavy on individuals. One is limited access. That there's trouble accessing basic healthcare, and LGBTQ plus individuals are less likely to have healthcare insurance, either because they've been rejected in social systems by when they were young, or they're unemployed, or they're homeless. So if I don't know if I'm even going to get seen by a doctor, I definitely don't want to go to the doctor's office. This may be something you're dealing with, especially in the course of your work, and why an individual, a kiddo, may not want to go to a doctor's appointment. Think about the negative experiences that that individual may have had, even if they made it to their medical appointment, right? How they're greeted by the staff in the hospital, how a doctor, if a doctor is willing to use their pronouns or their name, if a doctor is even familiar with the terminology, right? And you're thinking to yourself, think about this, I've got diabetes, right? If I go to a doctor to manage my diabetes and I said, oh, hey, doc, it's good to see you. And he says, how can I help you today? I said, I need some tips on managing my diabetes. And the doctor says, I'm sorry, what? What's diabetes? You think I want to go there and stay with that doctor very long? Probably not, right? And also, if that doctor is going to give me recommendations when they don't even know what it is, I'm going to be really skeptical, right, of what that doctor is prescribing to me. It's the same thing. It's trust, right, in that person that's sitting in front of us. And the last thing is lack of knowledge, right? This is why we do trainings like this, but this is why I want to do it from a culturally humble approach. I don't want us to assume we know everything after one training, but maybe this allows us to kind of think about where are our own opportunities to grow in some knowledge in these areas so we can be the best we can be for our clients in front of us, right? The good thing is training, education, that all makes a difference for our clients. We can fix all of these things, right? It really comes down to trust and education. The last bit I wanted to talk about, social determinants for health, and this is sort of the weight, the sociological imagination of attempting to see the world through the eyes of those we're serving, is around primarily also a fear of not only being belittled and isolated because of our identity, but also being harmed as a result of it, right? So LGBTQ plus individuals that I've worked with have often said, look, part of your privilege as identifying as cisgender male is you can hold your partner's hand in public and not worry about being called names. But on top of that, you don't have to worry about being jumped in the parking lot of a nightclub. It says you can walk home dressed how you want to dress and not worry about being assaulted, but I can't have that same luxury, at least not in this environment, okay? This is a real weight that some of our kiddos and families carry with them. We see this manifested in FBI data, hate crimes up 17% from 2017 to 2019 related to sexual orientation or identity. And primarily what we're seeing is in relation to sexual orientation, 57.8% were victims of crimes motivated by the offender's anti-gay male bias. So the majority of these crimes are being targeted towards gay males, and then 24.9% victims of anti-lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender bias. So this is an important piece for us to understand if you're ever working with a client who feels trusting enough of you to come out and share their identity with you. That's a big deal for them. It's a big deal for you, because what they've said is, I feel comfortable enough with you to tell you who I am in completeness, right? But I'm also sharing with you that these are some of my fears. And imagine what that's like when we go to someone that we love and trust enough to be able to say, hey, I'm going through something right now. We understand that what they're going through often accompanies those feelings of fear. And we want to embrace all of that the same way that we're embraced by those that we love, okay? I'm going to tie this very briefly into some scripture, right? One of the things I love about Olive Crest are our values and our calling to do the work that we do in a spiritual aspect. And now then I'm going to give you some strategies, all right, that you can use with families, if that helps, okay? So many of you have seen this analogy before. If you've done a training with me, I keep coming back to it because it's important. If we look at society as this piece of paper, right, this lined college ruled paper right here, right, the individuals that would fall in the middle of this paper are considered mainstream society. All the individuals that we would consider to be what we would say as having normal traits within our society hold power or privilege here. Me identifying as cisgender male heterosexual, I fall in the middle, okay? Our individuals who fall outside of that category, oftentimes what we've seen historically have been pushed to the margins of society, the outside pieces of this paper here on the margins. I use this analogy because the process of when we push people to the outside of society is called marginalization. Marginalization, when we marginalize other people, okay? But one of the things that I love about all of you and the work that you're doing every day, I see this as 189 people on our phone today or on our call today who are here for a different purpose. And if you identify as Christian, there's something that really resonates with all of us in the work that we're doing. There's a scripture verse from Jeremiah 33 that's really powerful. This is the Message interpretation of that. And in Jeremiah, it says, you're going to look at this place, these empty and desolate towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem, and say, a wasteland unlivable, not even a dog could live here, right? Think about that. The clients that you face, the troubles that they're experiencing, right? They're telling you life is tough right now, right? I've got court cases to deal with. I'm managing my sobriety. My marriage is in the toilet. My kiddos are unsafe. I worry for them, right? Life is difficult. I don't even know if I can continue, right? But in Jeremiah, it goes on to say, but the time is coming when you're going to hear laughter and celebration, marriage festivities, people exclaiming, thank God of the angels' armies, he's so good. And later in Jeremiah, God goes on to say, I'll restore everything that was lost in this land. I'll make everything as good as new. I, God, say so. Think about that work that you're doing with your families every day, right? What I see is all of you running to the margins every single day. You have a lot in common with Christ's ministry of what he did every single day, because what did God do? He frustrated everyone in power because he ate dinner with everyone that was considered social outcasts. Everyone that was pushed to the margins, he said, come and eat with me. If you're sick, I'm going to go over there and heal you. If you're blind, I'm going to give you sight. If you're a woman, I'm going to give you a voice, right? And that's the work that you're doing with your children and families every day. All of your kiddos have been marginalized, pushed to the margins through trauma and systems. And you're saying there's a place for you here. So I just wanted to make that connection in the work that we're doing, right? The greatest tool, and I'm going to move into tools now, strategies you can use with your children and families. And it really, though, the primary foundation that we need to work from is a place of hope. If I can give you all of these strategies in the next 3 slides, okay? But if we're not coming from a place of empathy and hope and delivering that to our families, they really won't do much good, okay? Dr. Brene Brown had said, we need hope like we need air. Think about that for a second, right? Our kiddos who are coming to you and they're scared and they're saying, I want to come out. I want to share something with you that I'm really worried about and scared, right? What they're looking for is they're saying, I just want hope, right? I want hope that maybe tomorrow won't look the same as today, right? That's hope. All right. So we use a word in our field. We like to use this word a lot, and that's empathy. Empathy, right? Empathy is feeling with another human being. Empathy is refraining from judgment, even though we feel like it's going to be so helpful at times to do so, and it feels good for us, right? Empathy is really a deep sense of caring for the person that's sitting in front of us, caring so deeply that even if people have a different experience than us, they see the world different than us, we may not agree with what they do all the time, we still care for them because we're there to serve them, okay? Fred Rogers had a beautiful quote on what it meant to care, right? And he said, caring comes from this Gothic word, cara, which means to lament, right? So Fred Rogers had said, so caring is not what a powerful person gives to a weaker one. Caring is a matter of being there, lamenting right along with the one who laments. Think about that. Think about your work that you're doing with your children and families. A kiddo comes home into residential care. They sit on the couch. They're cursing under their breath. They've been bullied all day long, and they're lamenting, right? It's not about a power relationship of being the staff to say, suck it up, we've got a routine to do, right? Even though I know none of you would do that. Caring, empathy, is sitting down next to them and saying, I'm sorry that you had that rough day at school. I'm sorry that you had to go through all of that. When you're ready, I would love to be able to talk to you about it, offer any help that I can give you. That's empathy, that's lamenting, okay? I worked with a kiddo one time who really left this impression on me, who was a member of the LGBTQ plus community. We were having a really great conversation about services and the work that had been done, the transformation had taken place over the course of working with this kiddo for a year. And he said something that was really powerful. He said, look, I'm a human being, right? Having this human experience. So I'm not asking you necessarily really to accept me or even understand me. He says, I'm only asking really that you recognize that these feelings for me are real and that I manage them daily. Right? This is my reality. This is what I'm going through. I'm not going to ask you for this grand hope of you accepting who I am. I just need you to be able to be empathetic with me in the moment, to care for me while I'm in front of you, right? To give me hope. We can do that, I think, as practitioners, and I think you all do it well personally. Finally, a quote that I think really speaks well to empathy comes from my favorite poet, Maya Angelou, right? Who said, there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of us, right? So think about that. Not even in the context of LGBTQ+. We all have something that is a secret maybe that we just wish someone would know so that we didn't have to hold on to it anymore, right? Think about how heavy that weight is for us. Even if we don't identify as a member of the community, we can identify with the fact that we know what that weight feels like. And so when an individual comes to us and shares something with us that's deep and heavy about their sexual orientation or gender identity, one of the things that we could do is say, I understand what that weight must be like. How can we lift that burden for you? So that's just something to consider. Now, enough with the philosophical. Some of you are like, give me the goods, hurry up. We've got 30 minutes left. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you the practical tools, right, that you all can use today with families in your interactions and serving LGBTQ plus people, right? One is to stay curious, right? To ask questions. That's okay. It's important to maintain an attitude of respectful, keyword here, respectful curiosity, right? Especially if you're heterosexual or cisgender social worker serving clients, right? Don't be afraid to ask questions, but I have one bit of advice for you. In your process of learning and asking questions, you really only want to ask questions that are relevant for your work with the client, right? Think about that in our own context. If someone started out of nowhere that we've never met before, came up to us and who do you choose to date and why are you romantically attracted to that person and this and that, we would be like, why are you asking me this? How is it relevant, right? So as a guide, you want to just seek information that's relevant to your work. Making eye contact is something that's really important, especially within the community, because it's employing these nonverbal cues that really say you're being heard, you're being validated. I was pretty shocked, and this is the privilege of my identity, right? When I was working with a kiddo who says, you'll be surprised that when I walk out in public, how many people just don't even look at me in the eye, right? When I step into a doctor's office, my doctor looks at my chart, they look at me, and they won't even make eye contact. It's like I'm not even here. That's an important piece. Watching our body language, sometimes, we're just hearing this and it's normal. We're kind of trying to take it in. And so we may give signs, right, that we're not even intending to do. So things like crossing our legs or arms or kind of shifting in our seat or looking down or uncomfortable, right? Many of you know this, children who have been physically abused, right, are also really good at picking up on nonverbal cues because it's a safety mechanism, right? If dad comes home and he's drunk and he's upset, the likelihood of that kid getting hit is going to be higher, right? So they learn to read those verbal cues. Same thing with other individuals who have experienced trauma. They're reading our body cues. And the second is trying to use open-ended language, right? Using inclusive language and not making assumptions. Many folks will appreciate the fact that if you say, what is your pronoun? Not what is your preferred pronoun, but what's your pronoun? They're more likely to say, okay, the fact that you even asked me means that you're open to a discussion, at least on me being here as I am, right? And so that can go a long way with your clients. Couple more, and I put the sources up here too, because there's more, but I wanted to highlight just a couple of these. When you all are developing case plans, when you're in CFTs, when you're building RAP plans of care, mental health assessments, whatever the case is, you can look at your documentation and you want to see if it's using inclusive language. Are we using the pronouns of the child or the name of the child? Are we using things he, she, they, them, in our paperwork? Does it reflect our population? We want to, as much as possible, the same way we give voice to children in households around other aspects of their identity, we want to encourage and express kiddos and families to talk about their interests and their activities around part of this aspect of their identity. So when we're designing service plans, case planning, or we're brainstorming interventions, don't avoid the kiddo afraid of what they might say. Ask them for their opinion, right? It can make a difference seeing it reflected in the plan. Couple more. Maintaining confidentiality is a huge component. We know this from a HIPAA standpoint, but especially with our kiddos, right? At times, we may want to go back to our team because we work in teams, and this kiddo may have come out to you, but that doesn't mean they've come out to the team, okay? And so if a kiddo comes out to you, you may want to ask the question to be very helpful. What is your comfort level in other team members being aware of this information? Are you comfortable with that? If they say no, we have to respect that privacy, okay? Remember I said that oftentimes coming out can be associated with fear of the social repercussions that can take place. So if we were to out another individual, we're leaving them in a very vulnerable spot, and that can break down. It can really crush that therapeutic alliance we have with the kiddo, okay? We want to examine things like the families that are serving within our organization. So if we have families, some that are saying they're more open to serving LGBTQ plus people than others, those might be good matches, right? When we're pairing families with one another. We want kids, same thing as like, you don't want to place a Spanish speaking kiddo, only Spanish speaking, in an English speaking home. It's similar to that, right? We want to make sure this is a fit. You also, and I think you all do so well, is you don't have to feel like the responsibility of representation lies only on you, right? That can feel heavy, right? Because we're not all experts in this. And so another piece to this can be, where are there other organizations in the community that can support youth and members of the LGBTQ plus community that we can link children and families to, right? So you're using inclusive language and positive attitudes and spirit in the meetings, but you also want to give that kiddo or that family a network of support outside of the meetings, outside of their services that they can go to. So sometimes it's just pairing with other organizations. Last slide, I promise you, right? One of the things we want to do too in this process of cultural humility is to conduct our own self-assessments, right? One of the things we want to do is determine how comfortable are we in talking about issues surrounding the LGBTQ plus community. How comfortable are we at utilizing different pronouns and names, right, that our clients use? Do we demonstrate this open, positive attitude towards all clients who come through our doors? And if not, how can we develop an understanding or more information through education on how to serve this particular group? So one of the things to keep in mind is, training doesn't end with an hour and a half, right? Hopefully what I've done is I've given you enough information where you can say some of this was interesting and I may already know it. Some of this I was unfamiliar with today, but maybe it's leading me to start to want to learn more about this community so that I can show up and be the best that I can be around them, right? Last bit that I want to share with you, and then I'll open up for questions and answers, okay? I want to give us a license here with one another. For these trainings, I know sometimes it may sound great in theory. You may look at the training and say, this was great, thank you for the information, and I'm still terrified to go out and do anything about it, right? And I hear you, I understand where you're coming from. You feel nervous about using some of these terms or diving into this content. I want to give us a license like Brene Brown did, and this is in her book, Dare to Lead, that I think is important, right? She talked about having hard conversations. And I want to give you the license to say to yourself that you agree to practice empathy. Remember, feeling with another human being. You're going to agree to even screw it up at times. But when you do, you're going to circle back, clean it up, and try again. Why? Because none of us are perfect. And I think that in my work with members of the LGBTQ+ community over the years, what's meant almost more to them than getting it right the first time was the willingness to keep coming back and trying to get it right. There's a quote from Brene Brown, the last one that I wanted to share with you, which I think is beautiful and speaks to this process, right? Make the commitment to yourself, your team, your friends, and your family. You have no idea how much it means to someone when you circle back to them and say, you shared something hard with me and I wish I had shown up in a different way. I really care about you and what you shared. Can I try it again? I have had to use this phrase many times in the course of my case management, not just with LGBTQ+ members, but all kinds of backgrounds, right? Backgrounds that at the time I didn't understand. And as a result of that, I didn't show up as my best. And at times I had to apologize to that family and say, I'm sorry, right? That's the version of me that you got. Would you find it in your heart to allow me to show up next week, right? To circle back and try to get this right for you because you matter to me and you deserve the best. Would that be okay? 99% of the time, your families are going to say, I appreciate that so much. Yeah. Let's give it another go next week. Okay. All right. All right. So finally, these are some resources that I wanted to leave you with. Again, these will be in the PowerPoint. So even if you want to take a screenshot or you watch the recording later, you're more than welcome to check these out. But what I did was I divided them by websites and by reading, and I have a few more for you too. If there's a one place to start, if you're just kind of curious about this topic and you want to continue to dive into it, a really nice place to start is here, the Human Rights Campaign. hrc.org. They have a number of resources, free trainings, updates on things like policy, legislation, terminology that might be helpful for you to dive into this topic. This is always a great place to start. On the last slide here of resources, these are actually resources that may be helpful for your kiddos and your families that you're working with. These are connections. Remember I said like partnering with organizations that can serve all populations that might be helpful for you to check out for you and your families, okay? Finally, I wanna say thank you so much for your time, for your ears, and I wanna say I really appreciate just the openness and that you've shown for today. I really appreciate you all right? And so what I'm gonna do is I'll stay on if there's any questions. If there's no other questions, I want to let you know I'm praying for you and the work that you're doing. And from the bottom of my heart, I miss you all. And I wish you the best of luck with your families and your kiddos. All right. Thank you all so much.
And before everybody signs off, please take a couple minutes to